Among the body of Messiah, there are those who hold the position that God rejected Israel for their disobedience, and that Gentile believers have replaced the Jews. This is rather widespread. Paul addresses the matter in chapter 11 of his letter to the believers in Rome. I say then, has God cast away his people? Certainly not. But God has given them a spirit of stupor, eyes that they should not see, and ears that they should not hear, to this very day. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Certainly not. Do not boast or be arrogant against the branches that were cut off. That blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles, the nations, the ethnos has come in. And those are verses 1, 8, 11, 18, and 25 in Romans chapter 11. Furthermore, God has shut them all up, that's Jews and Gentiles, to disobedience, that he might have mercy on them all. Verse 32. How curious, how surprising, how strange that God would make it so that the truth of something would not be recognized. Why did God choose sovereignly to shut Israel up? What we read in Romans 11:8, we see in Isaiah chapter 6, verses 10 to 13. He shut them up. He closed their eyes. He closed their ears that they couldn't hear and they couldn't turn. What a strange thing that is. So Israel was made responsible for a law that no one could keep, the result of which had the appearance of their having been cut off from God. We find this same dynamic in Yeshua's expression on the cross. When seen in the light of what's written, Psalm 22 begins with, my God, why have you forsaken me? And continues on to describe the horrific experience of crucifixion. But then in verse 24, we read, for he has not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, nor has he hidden his face from him. But when he cried to him, he heard. And this so aptly describes what Israel felt and how it looked from the outside. God planned it for a reason. In the face of Israel's rejection, as the stewardship of the gospel would then be committed to the Gentiles, they would surely think that they had become the new chosen ones as a result of Israel's failure. So, Israel had a 2,000-year stewardship of the Word of God, of His presence. The Gentiles have also now had a 2,000-year chance to find out in the end that even with the full revelation of the New Testament, neither could they prepare, could they become a suitable dwelling place for the presence of the Lord. And actually, only with the Jews and Gentiles, knowing that we are all the same, would it be possible for us to come together as the body of Messiah. Actually, you could say, we're all tied for last place in the race. We each had our chance, and we've each blown it. Neither one of us have been able to fulfill the calling. Now, what we call the Old or Mosaic Covenant was inaugurated at Mount Sinai. And the agreement was subsequently broken. And God inaugurated a new covenant that was prophesied in Jeremiah 31. Now understand this. The Old Covenant was an agreement with promises and requirements that delineated the dynamics of relationship between God and Israel. And the nations were not included. The Old Testament is a testimony, it's a story, and it recounts the facts of who said what and did what, when, and to whom. To not understand this simple difference between covenant and testament and use the words interchangeably causes one to think that the recorded biblical history prior to Yeshua is essentially of no importance. Do you get that? If we don't understand the difference between covenant and testament, we think it's all passed away, but it's not. The Old Testament remains. It's a story. So Genesis begins with the creation of heaven and earth, and Revelation ends with a new creation. Genesis is chapter 1. So is the Gospel of Matthew chapter 1 of the New Testament? Or is it actually chapter 40 of the whole book, of the Bible, of the one story? No one would start reading a book in the middle and expect to understand the plot and the flow. How could we understand the message of the Bible if we start reading in chapter 40? Things that God reveals about himself in the first part of the Bible. And, perhaps it might be helpful to think of it as the first part and the second part rather than the old and the new. So what God revealed in the first part, he didn't need to repeat in the second part. He doesn't change. He's been the same all throughout. But some of us tend to look and miss that. Now, here's a word about this commonly related to phrase, concept, reality of being grafted in. How important is this to the brethren in the nations? It says, if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them became a partaker of the root and fatness of the olive tree. So the point of being grafted in is to be able to partake of the root. But notice, they were grafted in among them. Picture that. Grafted in among them. And with them became a partaker of the root. You know, it's like if we know that Yeshua is Lord, but we don't follow him, we know that he's Messiah, but we don't walk with him, we don't have relationship with him, do we have salvation? What is the evidence, actually, then, of being grafted in? There is a picture here, according to what's written. Because if the nations, if the Gentile peoples are not partaking of the root and the fatness of the olive tree, then they're not actually grafted in. So what we're reading here is that if there isn't the testimony of them being among them, I mean, that means that somehow, in some way, they're here, there's a relationship, and that the attitude of what is being done, if not an actual physical dynamic, is a sense of being with them. In other words, it breaks down the them and us. When we are with them, we're all us, and we're no longer them. In keeping with this essential character of the one new man, it makes sense that the fullness of what Israel was given cannot be partaken of outside of being in relationship with the natural branches. It's just, we want what you have, but we don't want you. That doesn't really sound like something that reflects the dynamics and nature of God. Here's another thought. In keeping with painting this picture of the relationship of Israel and the church. So the first part of the Bible is exclusively centered around Israel, while the second, though it begins with the Jews, ends up including all the rest of the nations, who are, of course, far greater in number. In the first part, except for the prophets and various other ones, God primarily didn't relate to individuals. The priests went to God on behalf of the people. And if one was uncircumcised or broke the Sabbath, for example, it says that he was cut off from among his people. We read that Genesis 17 and Exodus 31. So the Old Testament framework was about being part of the nation with whom God was relating. Now, a manifestation of this mentality is if you ask unbelieving Gentiles if they believe in Yeshua, they would say, no, I don't believe. But if you ask unbelieving Jews if they believe, the reply would be, we don't believe. Throughout the first part of the Bible, the community is a major aspect. It's the vehicle through which spiritual life is experienced. Now, the essence of the New Covenant, and what we refer to as Christianity, is that through Yeshua, every individual can have a personal relationship with God. So as the Old Testament, the first part of the Bible, emphasizes the community, the New Testament emphasizes the individual. Now, if we believe the first part of the book was for the Jews and the second part was for the nations, if we believe that we are called to leave the old and move on to the new, if we have made personal salvation our target, our sole focus, perhaps this might account for the difficulty in which we find ourselves as a church. That though we speak of love and unity, our functional values are decidedly individual and not corporate. So how much is our lack of understanding and relationship with Israel a factor in the current state of the church? In short, the belief that God rejected Israel for their disobedience has had a profoundly negative effect on the character of the body of Messiah. The process of the nations being brought in includes their finding out that we are all the same. The same pride has blinded all of our eyes. The Jews were the custodians of the revelation for 2,000 years and failed. The Gentiles also had 2,000 years and found out that neither could they be faithful either. Again to say, as written in Romans 11:32, only Jew and Gentile walking together, knowing that we are tied for last place in the race, will come to the necessary revelation of brokenness to prepare a suitable place for the presence of the Lord.